seem to fall to the floor.
I'd like to commemorate this video to the Inco Rightmo month of February. I sent a letter to Yasushi Hisha, who's the president of Sailor Pen Company, and I mentioned I was going to be doing this video, so here it is. Welcome back to another pen talk. This is the pen that's going to be a focus for this talk. You may kind of recognize it and then maybe not recognize it. It is a Sailor Prophet, or as we call them in this country, the 1911 Standard. It's their kind of entry-level high-end pen, as I would describe it. In doing my research, because these pens are probably from the mid to late 1990s, maybe as late as 2005, I haven't been able to pin down when these pens were made. As you know, I love my books, so I went to what was probably the source for information, Fountain Pens of Japan by Andreas Lambeau and Magamachi Tsunami. And that book does not even mention the 1911, so I had to do some work. The interesting thing is, if you go to the Sailor website, they now call these pens 1911s. There's some slight differences in some of the features on the pen from this version of it, but why do I have two of them? Well, I think the nibs are excellent, and I would relate these nibs to what people talk about with Mont Blancs. The vintage Mont Blancs have nibs that are different than the nibs in the modern Mont Blancs. They're a little softer. They just have a different feel to them, and these pens here are similar in that way. Vintage 1911, we'll call it, and here's the modern version. They added another cap ring here at the top, which to me kind of mimics Mont Blanc and other pen manufacturers. This pen kind of looks like a 146, 144 version from Mont Blanc. The clip is very similar. We'll get a little bit of a close-up there. Yeah, there's not a lot of changes to the clip. This one has, the lines are a little bit more distinct. This is a little bit of a transition there. The top of the pen is pretty much the same. And, you know, the cap bands say exactly the same thing. The engraving is slightly different, but not significant. The main addition is that extra cap band. And when we unscrew and look at the nib, that's where you'll find the biggest differences between the pens. The one on the left is the vintage one, as I'll call it vintage. And it has a much plainer design on the nib. It's not as ornate. I mean, the main feature is that kind of large anchor, and then Sailor is a little bit less distinct. There's also a gold ring at the bottom of the section versus a gold ring at the top here on the newer version. And the newer version nib is a lot more ornate. The 1911 has been added to the nib. So it has the anchor design, but not quite the same. These 1911s, two vintage and two modern. So the one I was showing you before has a 21 karat nib, so we'll just bring the 14 karat one in just to show you that it is, you know, the same type of similarity there. The stamping on the 14 karat is clearer, and I think I've found a number of the 21 karats because it's a softer material, even though the nib doesn't feel that much softer. The imprint on the 14 karats is more pronounced. Take a look at the feed. The feed is pretty similar, just a minor difference there in the way that it's designed. The nib is also a little bit longer on the newer 1911 than the vintage one, but as I mentioned to you before, the writing style of the vintage is unique and I enjoy it. The other thing you'll take a look at is they mark the nibs on the side here. So that's a hard fine in the newer pen, and the vintage one is a HB hard broad. And if we take a look at the other vintage, you'll notice what I find to be the attraction to me in this nib is it's a SB soft broad. So I have a hard broad and a soft broad, and finding a soft sailor nib is very difficult to do. It took me many years to eventually snag this pen on eBay, and I was very happy with the price. You can see the design is very similar in the nib. And while we're talking about Sailor Vintage, I had to bring out my Magellan, which is also a pen that I snagged on eBay at a good price. So it's a pen they made kind of a commemorative pen in the mid to late 1900s. This is the blue version of it. If you open it up, you'll see that it has the same type of design nib as the other vintage 1911 Prophet standards have, and same design here on the section. But the feed is slightly different, more similar to the modern pens. So that's one of the things that Sailor's been extremely consistent on, and also, you know, the nib is marked on the left side of it. This is a hard fine, HF. And it has that classic anchor. This is my collection of Sailor pens. The vintage Magellan is on the far left, followed by the Pro Gear with the Nagayati Togi nib, which I really enjoy. Then Pro Gear Slim, which is in a nice speckly purple. The red with the black ends. The burgundy one, which has the same color throughout except for the section. That has the 21 karat nib in it. And then on the right are the two, what I would call vintage Prophets, early 1911s that only have a single cap band. Some screenshots from the Sailor website. So here's a nice description of the 1911 series. They are now using the word 1911 to describe this. And as you can see, the two versions are the 1911 Standard, which are the ones that we looked at in the video, and the 1911 Larges, which is, like I mentioned, a bigger pen. Here's a description of the 1911 Standard. You can see it's a fairly good nib selection. They call it PMMA resin. Some people call it precious resin. And there's also a number designation, as you can see, 11, 12, 19. That is a designation that Sailor uses on all their pens to indicate the model, the material on the nib, and the nib type, which would be the third set of digits. Here's the current colors in their line. As you can see, the red with the black ends is still in their line. They've added a blue one and a yellow one to them. Here's an ad showing you them really promoting the 1911, and the Standard is a subset of that, and then you got your Sailor logo. And here's another ad also promoting the 1911 model. So those of you that may not be familiar with the Prophet or 1911 Sailor, it's a relatively small pen. We'll give you those dimensions, and you've seen the comparison. It's certainly, to me, designed to be used posted, so therefore it fits any hand and posted. The section is also a little bit on the small side, but from a writing experience, that works okay with me. I think you can hear the fact that this thing is extremely smooth. I mean, to me that's a Sailor characteristic, and it exists in all the Sailors that I have. Even the less expensive ones with steel nibs, they have extremely smooth writing. And this nib just has a little bit of bounce to it. It's not something I would use as a flex nib. It's soft, and soft is, I think, really means something a little bit different in a Japanese design nib for that marketplace. But this has to be about as smooth as any nib I've ever put to paper. And this is Fabriano paper that has a little bit of texture to the surface. In case you don't recognize the ink, it's Robert Oster ink. I'm not going to pronounce it, but I got it because I wanted to experiment in some of the alt red, rot as it is in German, inks, and so this one I like. It's in that kind of like dark red category. So let's compare that with the other nib that we have. So this is the and this is actually softer and it's not softer, but it's smoother than the other one, and actually looks to be a little bit broader. And there's not a lot of difference between these two nibs. I mean, considering they have two different designations, I expected the other one to be a little softer and this to be a little harder, but I enjoyed this pen when I got it a year or so ago. All of my sailors I've bought through Japanese suppliers, either eBay or retail, so I've never bought a sailor pen locally. I live in the United States, and the pricing is substantially different, significantly different, and I haven't had any negative experiences from buying a sailor before I had a chance to write with it. So just for comparison's sake, we're going to compare that to the 1911 that I have with the 21 karat, but this is a hard medium nib. Not quite as smooth as the vintage 14K hard broad, and actually the line is not that much different. So both of these inks are inked with Sailor Yamadori ink, which is also a great ink. I love the kind of bluish green color. They call it, I think, a pheasant is one of the descriptions that they use for it. But I mean, all these pens just write phenomenally well. This one, you can see you're not going to get any softness out of it like you did with the 14K vintage. So, a lot of people talk about, they like a higher gold content, and they feel that provides certain characteristics to the nib, but the nib characteristics are pretty much based on the metal, how it's formed, and how it is treated, that will make it either a soft nib or a stiff nib. And the gold content is not necessarily an indication of whether a nib is going to be soft or not. I studied metallurgy in my university days, and so they could add a few little alloys to the steel and make it as hard as anything. They could heat treat it, form it through working it, and change its properties substantially. So metal properties can vary quite a bit based on how the metal is done, both from an ingredients viewpoint and from how they've worked the metal. Here are the three pens written together, and there's not a lot of difference between these three nibs, even though they have much different designations: hard broad, soft broad, and hard medium. You got your 14, you got your 21K. The soft broad is definitely the wider of the three nibs, and both the vintage nibs have a little bit of flex to them and open up a little bit when you put some pressure on a downward stroke, where the hard medium definitely does not. But they're all extremely smooth, incredible good ink flow. So from that perspective, I'm very pleased with Sailor's consistent quality and their attributes of their nibs. People speak highly of them, and I see no reason from my experiences to not sing their praises also. Enjoyed this look at some interesting Sailor pens. So thank you for watching. May you have many excellent writing experiences. Enjoy, explore the wonderful world of pens, and hopefully they add joy to your life. Till later, bye.